Okay, great. Thank you all for coming here today. I am Valerie Scott, Legal Coordinator for Sex Professionals of Canada, and with me is Alice Klein, CEO and founder of Now Magazine, and Akio Maroon, Chair of Maggie's Toronto Safer Sex Project, and Richard Elliott, Executive Director of the Canadian HIV and AIDS Legal Network. Today is International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, and this is an important day in the sex worker community. We remember the appalling violence that our colleagues have suffered at the hands of predators. It's important to know that predators are not our clients. They are simply predators. And the Supreme Court of Canada, 1 year ago, agreed with us. They agreed that it was the old regime under the old laws that forced us to work under dangerous conditions that caused all of this violence. The Harper government's response to this was to enact a new set of violent and coercive laws, the Orwellian named Protection of Exploited Protection of Exploited Persons and Communities Act, which will protect no one, and it will increase violence against sex workers by forcing us to work secretively, independent of each other, and untraceably. And that seems to be okay for the Harper conservative base. These laws are all about trying to push us out of the way, throw us under the rug, and legislate us out of existence. That will never happen. The majority of us will continue to work. And also, we will fight these new laws. Make no mistake about that. It's just a matter of time. But in the meantime, we urge the Attorney General of Ontario to please review these laws and enact a policy of non-enforcement. Nothing good will come of them. You cannot stop sex work, nor should you want to stop sex work. And there is now a growing and a global sex worker rights movement. In just about every country on this planet, there is now a sex workers' rights organization. This cannot be stopped. You just cannot stop people seeking justice. And so we will fight these laws. We've done it once before, and we will do it again. And thank you. So now, Alice Klein.
Okay. Once again, it's a pleasure to be here celebrating this important day. Now Magazine has always was really founded on the proposition of giving voice to the voiceless and speaking truth to power, and our advertising policy was based on that. We refuse to have a policy that discriminates against sex workers, and we also felt that we had no place, and I think Canadians probably in large part agree, no place in making moral judgments about what happens between consenting adults in the bedroom. So at this time, we're very proud to stand with sex workers. It's a cruel irony that it is our an advertising policy that is the issue at this time, and yet that is so appropriate in another way that we as a business are wholly engaged in the process of free expression. So we are at this time attempting to mitigate the negative effects of these laws to the extent that we're able, based on the legal advice of our very wise counselor. Alan Young, who won the Bedford case. And but what I really want to share with you most of all is that in these just very short times since this law has come into effect, the relationship between the advertising provision and the safety and security of sex workers has come into stark relief. And the way in which the advertising ban infringes on the constitutional rights of sex workers to safety and security has become incredibly evident as we hear from sex workers outside of Toronto and really all over the business about the harms that they are experiencing as they deal with the fact that they are denied the right to this advertising, which gives them a way to safely and securely conduct their business. People are worried. They're worried about losing their homes. They're worried about losing their livelihoods. They're worried about what tragic effect this is going to have on their lives. So I'm very proud to join together today to urge our Premier Kathleen Wynne to thank Kathleen Wynne for referring this question to the Attorney General and calling upon the Attorney General to really look seriously and suggest to the Premier to really proceed with not enforcing this law. It is creating clear and immediate danger in the lives of women. Thank you.
Who's next?
I'm sorry. Yes. Akil, yes. Chair of Maggie's.
Good morning. On today, the International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, I'm here to plea not to sidestep the democratic process, but to realize and to ask folks to have a look at the laws that were created. And when they do, they will realize that it actually enables violent predators and their acts against sex workers. As a human rights activist for the last 10 years, I've studied the Ontario Human Rights Code as it relates to employment. And one of the purposes of the Ontario Human Rights Code is to protect against discrimination against such things as work. Sex workers, we're talking about consensual sex between adults, and that is work, it is employment. It is employment that women, men, and trans folks have engaged because that is their chosen employment. And we want to call on our entire province to stand with sex workers to say that this piece of law, even though it used a democratic process, it stands against everything that we believe and everything that we stand for as a nation. Peter MacKay has said that the federal government designed these laws to make it easier for sex workers to exit the trade. However, sex workers are consensually engaging in sex work. And what Mr. MacKay has done with these laws is not only open the door, but the window, and has spread the welcoming mat for all sexual predators to feast on the lives of sex workers. Bill C-36 and the law that came about recreates the laws and the provisions struck down by the Bedford case, allowing the epidemic of violence against sex workers to continue. This new law views all sex workers as victims, and I'm here to represent our sex workers to say we are not victims. We do not need to be saved. We are calling for full decriminalization, and in the absence of that, and until we wait until the election next year, we're calling on Ontario to not engage in actively arresting our clients, harassing our women on the streets, our trans folks, folks from the migrant community. We're asking for you to realize that this piece of law, this piece of legislation, goes against everything that we believe, everything that we are as Canadian citizens when we want to protect each other, comfort each other, and love each other. I ask that you respect our choices as sex workers to work with freedom and with dignity and without harassment. I'm asking for non-enforcement. Thank you.
Okay. And Richard Elliott, the Executive Director of Canadian HIV and AIDS Legal Network.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. As you've heard, I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, which is a non-governmental organization that works to defend and promote the human rights of people living with HIV and of communities affected by HIV, and to ensure that our laws and policies respect and advance human rights in responding to the epidemic. We do this for two reasons, and I want to articulate them because it's relevant to why we're involved in this. The first is because it's a basic principle that all people are entitled to fundamental human rights. Ultimately, it's about the right to dignity and to live without fear and want. The second reason is that ensuring human rights is essential to enabling an effective response to HIV. When human rights are violated or denied, it impedes HIV prevention and care. And it's for both those reasons that we have stood and continue to stand in solidarity with sex workers in speaking out against the ways in which the law continues to violate their rights by criminalizing them, their clients, and their work. Criminalizing sex work is wrong because of the harm it causes to sex workers, and that includes undermining their ability to control their working conditions to protect themselves, whether it's against violence or HIV. As you've heard, in last year's Bedford decision, the Supreme Court of Canada struck down several provisions of the Criminal Code as unconstitutional because they unjustifiably violated the charter rights of sex workers to security of the person. The harm they caused to the health and safety of sex workers was at odds with the principles of fundamental justice. Yet sadly, it is entirely foreseeable that the new laws that have just recently come into force will generate the same harms. The federal government, excuse me, the federal government has largely repackaged the same harmful provisions in new wording and slapped a new label on them, this time claiming that the objective is to abolish prostitution and declaring all sex workers to be exploited victims in need of protection. The first of these is simply ludicrous. The latter is simply inaccurate. But sadly, these laws do not protect. In fact, they do the opposite and will be especially harmful to those women, men, and transgender people in the profession who are already marginalized by society. We are therefore heartened that Premier Wynne has expressed her grave concerns about the new legislation and has asked the Attorney General of the province to examine whether it is constitutional. Today, we are releasing a letter to the Attorney General and the Premier of Ontario, signed by 190 lawyers and counting, outlining their concerns that the harmful new legislation is indeed unconstitutional. Similar concerns are being brought forward today to the Attorney General of British Columbia. We urge the Attorney General of Ontario, indeed provincial attorneys general across the country, not to be complicit in the enforcement of harmful laws that will lead to further violence, further injury, and further death for sex workers in Canada. This is not just, and it is not in the public interest. Thank you.
All right. Are there any questions?
What power do the premiers have to not enforce the law? Is that an option premiers have in this country to say, no, we're just not going to enforce a federal law?
Richard?
Do you want me to speak to that? So the premiers will have to be guided by the advice that they receive from their attorneys general, who are the chief legal advisors to their government. I think we should wait and see what advice the Attorney General comes back with to the Premier, and then figure out how the Premier can best work with sex workers and their allies to avoid enforcing the law in ways that are going to actually lead to further death and violence. I think it's important to see what the Attorney General makes of the law, and then discuss with the Premier how to proceed from there.
Has that happened before? Is there a precedent for an entire province ignoring a federal law?
There are certainly instances in which direction has been given, and this is not controversial, to Crown attorneys about how vigorously or not to enforce particular provisions of the criminal law as a policy matter. We've seen that in Ontario in the past. And we've also seen instances in the past where, even though charges have been laid by police, the Attorney General of the day has actually decided, for very good reasons, articulated to the public, why they're going to stay the charges and not proceed with them. The example of charges laid against Dr. Henry Morgentaler for abortion under the old abortion laws many years ago are a good example where the Attorney General of the day chose not to proceed with those charges.
So to be clear, you're in favor of the approach taken right now where Premier Wynne has said she's asking the Attorney General to look into it, but in the meantime, they'll be enforced until that advice comes back. They're going to enforce the law. You're okay with that?
No.
It sounded like you were saying was okay to wait to see what the Attorney General said.
And in the interim, speaking from street-based sex workers and sex workers at large in Toronto, in the interim, we're calling for non-enforcement of these laws.
Yes.
It is it is unacceptable to continue to violate the rights and dignity of workers in Toronto while we wait to hear back from the province.
And just to be clear, my remarks were in the same vein. It would be strange, it seems to me, if the Premier, having expressed grave concerns about whether the law is constitutional precisely because of the risk of harm that it poses to sex workers, and having asked her Attorney General for advice, would then say, well, we're just going to go ahead and force it in the meantime, when we clearly know that there's this potential for harm. That does not seem to be the right course of action. So I think the unanimous message is you should not be enforcing a law when you've already said that we have grave concerns it's not constitutional.
And I would like to underscore that and say that I think it would be of grave concern to suffer a police attack as an independent media outlet at this time when these laws are so clearly unjust. Yeah, so.
Yeah, advertising is important for sex workers because it is, it's important for us to be able to communicate. In 1992, Parliament enacted a statutory definition of consent. And in 1999, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that that meant that the complainant stated by words and conduct, words or conduct, her willingness to engage in sexual activity. So to make it illegal for one group of people to communicate their consent it just seems odd to me. And advertising is a form of communication. It's the beginning of a dialogue between us and our clients in terms of what we do, what we do not do, all kinds of things. So if the definition of voluntary consent is there, how can it be denied to sex workers?
Just walk through how the advertising keeps you safer, how it allows you to communicate with clients in a way that makes you safer.
Well, yes, if we can't communicate with our clients, then everything is vague and open to misunderstandings. That in and of itself can create violence. It doesn't have to have anything to do with money. If it's just the dating world, if things are all vague and if there are not clear parameters, and for the safety of sex itself, we have these things in place. And I think for the safety of sex workers, we should also be able to communicate, and advertising is a very, very important part of that.
And it's a model of harm reduction, what sex workers are willing to engage in and what some are willing to engage in and what some are not willing to engage in. And it's important for us to be able to communicate that to our clients, to say, like, these are activities that we are willing to do, these are activities that we're not willing to do, and risks we're willing to take on and risks we're not willing to take on. If we're unable to communicate that clearly to our clients, then it leaves lots of room for ambiguity. And ambiguity with regards to sex, we're talking about consent, and the potential there for harms for sex workers. And this is how our federal government and Peter MacKay, the Justice Minister, has gone against the rights of sex workers to consent.
And I would just add that if it's possible, as some interpretations of the new law suggest, that newspapers or other platforms that carry advertisements placed by sex workers face possible criminal prosecution, then you've shut down one way of sex workers connecting with their clients and earning a living, and you leave the only form of advertising then to be advertising by your physical presence on the street. And we know that that often tends to carry higher risks of violence. Partly then because another part of the new law, which is very similar to the old law, kicks in, and that is any communication between the sex worker and his or her client on the street exposes now the client, and in some cases also the sex worker, to the risk of prosecution under the new communication offense, which the Supreme Court had already said leads to potential risks for sex workers because of the difficulty of screening clients and engaging in that kind of conversation and negotiation that was just being referred to. So it actually operates at multiple levels, and the pieces are interconnected to create that environment of risk for people.
You're also talking about sex workers. A lot of sex workers in Toronto, for example, work indoors. They are highly educated, master degree students from some of Canada's most prestigious universities. And if you're talking to, some of these women and trans folks and men, do not necessarily have the street savvy to be on the street. So if Peter MacKay is forcing these sex workers who are consenting to activities with regards to their employment out on the streets, and they do not have the street smarts or street skills to survive, we are now putting them at greater harms. We are very, very concerned at Maggie's. Our sex workers are fearing for their lives. And as I've mentioned, this leaves a gaping door open for sexual predators.
Are you preparing resources so that if Now Magazine is prosecuted, that you're able to challenge that in court? Is that something you're preparing for?
Well, we are continuing to be, vocal opponents with our allies, our wonderful allies here, in building broad opposition. That's one way that we're building support, and of course we have legal advice, and we're doing our best to meet the challenge of this law. But of course, to have, at this difficult time in the media generally, to have the worry about whether police are going to be arriving at our door, that I don't think is really the kind of risk that our kind of quality independent media should be dealing with in the Canadian context. That seems totally wrong.
How have the ads that you accept changed? Are you accepting the same things you were before, or is there some things that you're no longer taking, some ads you're no longer taking because of the law?
We are transitioning to a process where we are taking advertising from individual, independent sex workers, and that's the big change.
So no agencies, just individuals?
That's right.
Do you believe that is legal under this law?
We do believe that, but obviously the actual provisions of this law, are unclear until tested in court.
And we're very thankful for the support that we've gotten from our allies, such as Now Magazine, who understand that this is our legal right to have consensual sex with whomever we want to, under whatever premises and agreements that we make. It is our body and it is our right, and we cannot and will not allow the democratic process to criminalize us and victimize us. We're not worried about our clients. We're worried now about the democratic process. Peter MacKay and the Harper government has done us a great injustice. We will continue to work, and we will adjust the ways in which we work, but we will work, and we will fight the laws in the meantime, and we will ensure that our sex workers show up to the polls next year when the federal election is.
Is there not some maybe possible ambiguity between what the Premier wants or what the federal government wants and what local police are actually enforcing on the ground? So like how, in the interim, as you guys are trying to get this change, what about local police who are looking at the law as it is and being like, we're told to enforce the law?
Well, as Richard mentioned, there's a difference between, or I should say, the cooperation between the police force and the Crown, in which you can arrest as many sex workers as you like, if Ontario actually stands up for our rights and justices and liberties, and stands up for regular, everyday Ontarians who choose sex work, then we won't be prosecuted. And the Toronto Police Force, for example, is already burdened with their own travesty. Recently, an officer was found guilty of sex assault against the sex worker. And I think that the Toronto Police Services is already burdened with their own carding issues and issues of racial profiling in Toronto, to keep arresting sex workers who are consenting to this work only to not be prosecuted by the Crown.
We're talking about adult, like grown-up sex here. We're talking about consenting to adults. And to have our police departments run around like Keystone cops, arresting consenting adults for having sex, is something right out of the 19th century. And then, I mean, that would be laughable, except for the catastrophic harm that it will cause. So,
I think
yeah.
it's implicit, too, in the call for non-enforcement that obviously police, who are at the first stage of enforcement, are part of that call. It should not be a priority for police to enforce this new law, especially given that the Premier of the province has expressed grave concern about the potential harm and has asked her Attorney General to tell her whether it's constitutional or not. I think that should be a pretty clear signal to police forces across the province that if they start laying charges, there's a very real potential, and we would certainly encourage that those charges be stayed or withdrawn by Crown attorneys, because it's not in the interests of human rights, it's not in the interest of public health, it's not in the interest of justice for those prosecutions to go forward.
And I would add that, of course, all of the same is true for Now Magazine, and that insofar as Toronto is concerned, we are in discussion with the Toronto Police the service aspect that probably would be involved in laying of charges and sharing our interpretation of the law. And of course, we also stand on the fact, and we're very pleased to do so, that the majority of city councillors have signed on as opponents of Bill C-36 and are very much against enforcement. So that's going on.
To any of your knowledge, has there been any enforcement of this law so far?
As a representative of Maggie's, who represents the sex workers and the majority of the sex workers in Toronto, we have not been advised of any such actions. However, there are definitely grave concerns because the adjustments in which our sex workers will have to make in their lives will leave them at greater risk of being violated. Not only by our justice system, but by predators who are now enabled by this new law.
What happens is clients are terrified now to identify themselves to sex workers. So you end up taking booking calls from blocked numbers and text messages to your phone. You have no idea who that person is. So now we have recently seen violence against escorts in Toronto, which really began last October when all the stuff about the new law was in the press, and that's how it's been, and it's already caused harm. So at Sex Professionals of Canada, we're getting so many calls from women who are just overwhelmingly stressed out. And as you were saying earlier about so many sex workers now are in university and quite highly educated, and they really do not have the street smarts to work on the streets. So, we're talking with these women about, they're terrified about having to go and work on the street. I mean, Canada's becoming a very highly educated country, and lots of sex workers are in universities. In fact, at SPOC, we have trouble organizing meetings around midterms. So, yeah.
And I think one other piece to add with regards to how this law directly affects sex workers is based on our ability to screen our clients. Sex workers are very resilient, and we use each other for support. We depend on each other. We rely on each other's reviews of different customers. And if we're unable, because of this law, clients are now refusing the screening process because, for example, work information would be validated, home information would be validated. We now have clients who are afraid to lose their jobs because of the stigmatization of being a client of a sex worker, of fear of arrest. And so they're unwilling now to give their personal information and details. And so this inhibits sex workers from screening our clients. If we are not able to screen our clients, then we are unable to know who we're opening the doors to. We've seen cases in Brampton where sex workers are already being victimized. We're 2-3 weeks into this new law, and sex workers are already being victimized. At Maggie's, we ran a list of bad dates and bad calls and experiences that sex workers have had. And we use that list to screen clients. And if clients are unable to provide this, or unable or unwilling to give this information because of this new act, we're putting each other at risks.
So it seems like there's some delay here. It's being deferred until after the new year. The bill passed royal assent. And you're asking for a non-enforcement, but what seems to be the holdup from getting a response from Kathleen Wynne?
Well, we definitely appreciate her response, but it doesn't go far enough. We definitely are calling for non-enforcement. We cannot have the rights and liberties of Canadians, of folks living in Ontario with or without status, to be jeopardized in the meantime while everybody goes on break. We're looking at similar system with regards to carding, where it is such a huge issue here in Toronto. And recently the Toronto Police Services Board say, okay, well, let's bring this back in February of the new year. In the meantime, the rights and the liberties and the freedoms of Canadians will be approached. So we find it unacceptable. We absolutely decry it. We say we appreciate it, but she's a very savvy politician, Premier Wynne, and I trust that she knows she knows the law and what's behind it. So we definitely appreciate her stepping forward in the way that she has. And she's put her pension plan and funding from the federal government at risk, as we are aware of. The Harper government and Harper himself is unwilling and unable and has refused all her calls to meet with him. So by standing up for our rights, she's putting her entire political career at risk. We appreciate her, but it doesn't go enough.
And I would just add that it is important that the Premier has asked the Attorney General to examine the constitutionality of the legislation, and I think it's important that the Attorney General take the time to do that right, including meeting with sex workers and hearing how, in very practical ways, these new provisions will play out, affecting them, their clients, and their workplaces, and create the harms that we're talking about here. I think it's important that that be part of the Attorney General's analysis, and requests for meetings with the Premier and the Attorney General have been made. We're hopeful that those will indeed happen, because the Attorney General really can't make an informed assessment of the potential harm and the constitutionality of this legislation unless she hears from sex workers.
You mentioned allies that are helping out and strong enough. Has it been labor movement? Has it been social justice? How has this been intersectional? And what could your allies be doing to step up in the meantime, in the short term?
I've worked for the past 11 years as an occupational health and safety consultant, and I work for workers' rights. We're seeing labor movements. CUPE has recently released a statement supporting our rights and calling also for non-enforcement. I feel that, or we feel that our allies are definitely useful in turning the wheels of justice. They show up, they vote. The democratic process has been used, and so we definitely would like to push that further. That said, it's really important for sex workers to have a voice, and for our allies to not speak for us, but to say, like, this, these are the practical ways in which we can go about this. For example, sex workers' rights movements and funding are the challenges that will need to happen. It took 10 years for the Bedford case to make the changes that were needed, or to strike down the laws that were needed. It will take a lot of resources, financial and otherwise, to support another charter challenge.
Can I just add as well that you've got media allies that have come forward. You've got almost 200 lawyers across the country who've written to the Premier today. You've got CUPE, as was mentioned. You've got 25 city councillors. You've got a number of HIV organizations across the country, including several national organizations who have come out to say we have concerns about this law. So I think there is that broad support building for the demand that sex workers have been putting forward, and I think we need to keep building that.
And I
There are
think
over 60 organizations who have publicly stated that they're with us on this, and so that's good. It's for the union, OPSU, and many others.
Canadian Public Health
numerous.
Association,
Yeah.
the breadth of support around this issue is almost
Stunning.
it's stunning, and it continues to grow. And some of us who are allies are very committed to continue that process of gathering more and more support, because it's for it's incredibly important to deal with this new law. But there's a larger question as well of sort of really changing the conversation that has kind of maintained the respectability of discrimination and stigmatization against sex workers happening everywhere. And so while this huge range of support is really around the grievousness of this bill, it is also a part of the larger conversation that we're having in this country about violence against women, and about how much the marginalized women have borne the brunt of the problems around violence, and that's so based on discrimination and stigmatization of people who are outside of maybe the mainstream. So I think that that's an exciting aspect of what we're doing here today.
Yeah, the support is really something. I remember when in 1985, when the communicating law came into effect, I spoke at the parliamentary committee hearings back then against that law, and once that law came into effect, we had nothing. There were no organization, not one, would stand up with us. And to see now what it is, this groundswell of support for sex workers against these new laws it's heartening. And even to see Premier Kathleen Wynne refer this to her Attorney General it's truly something when you compare it with 1985.
We want to just bring home the message. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, though.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
Very good, so last few questions.
Okay. Thank you so much.